Good morning, I'm Joe Fryer.
And I'm Savannah Sellers. Thanks for joining us. In the middle of some breaking news, we're going to begin our show with the wave of pro-Palestinian protests at college campuses across the country. The demonstrations are calling for an end to the war in Gaza and for schools to stop doing business with Israel and companies that support Israel. They are some of the biggest to hit college campuses since the Vietnam War protests of the 1960s.
At the University of Wisconsin-Madison yesterday, police swept through an encampment and tore it down in a forceful confrontation with protesters. Dozens of people were arrested there. But the big breaking news this morning is happening right now at UCLA. Police in riot gear have started moving in on a protester encampment and dismantling it. Police started massing overnight after issuing protesters with an order to disperse. This comes after counter-protesters attacked the pro-Palestinian camp late Tuesday night. Police were criticized for being too slow to try and stop the violence.
The life-threatening assault we faced last night is nothing less than a horrifying, despicable act of terror.
During the 6-hour period in which I was attacked, the police stood by on the sidelines and watched as me and my fellow protesters were maced, were struck with heavy plastic cones, were struck with rocks, were struck with batteries, and were struck with firecrackers.
In a few moments, we're going to hear from Annika Bereni. She's the special pages editor for the University of Wisconsin-Madison student newspaper, the Daily Cardinal. But before that, let's get to what's happening right now. NBC News correspondent Steve Patterson is at UCLA, which is currently in the middle of a very tense face-off between police and protesters. This has been developing over the last 1 or 2 hours. Steve, what's the situation like right now? Obviously, the flashbang grenades going off in the background. What are you seeing and hearing?
Flashbangs and gas, Joe. I would call this now less of a confrontation and more of a demolition. Police are chewing through this camp like a bulldozer. If they confront protesters inside, those protesters are going down and being detained. We are watching it happen in real time. The police line has formed here. It is pushed this way. If you see any wood planks, that means police haven't gotten it to it yet. They've been deploying what appears to be some sort of gas, an irritant into the air as they fire flashbangs continuously. You see the blinking lights inside there, police in full riot gear using what appear to be some sort of pellet rifles as well in case there are agitators in the crowd. But the essential operation is happening, which is to destroy and dismantle this encampment, which has been here now for almost a week, piece by piece. And we're watching it happen. Protesters are on the outside of this, on the edges. You can see them sort of in Royce Hall, also the library behind me, which sort of contains people who are looking down at what's happening, but they have little in the way of power as police have sort of wedged their way inside. And they did it by coming right over the top of this. This has been almost a solid wall of wooden planks since we've been here, and certainly since police have started gearing up, so too have the protesters, sort of fashioning, wooden shields, using hard hats to try to battle back as these, flashbangs continue to go off. Police went almost right through that. They did issue, I want to say, fair warning, not only signaling on social media, obviously posturing as if they were going to go in, but in loudspeakers continuously, as they are happening right now, saying, we are coming in. If you are in, you will be arrested. This was declared unlawful even before those counter-protesters came and sort of sparked all of this. But now it has been declared unsafe. And that is the reason why police are now doing what they're doing. As we see now police sort of on the edges. We're looking at a new development here. Police now move. See this huge line wave moving inside. It looks like they're going to tackle it now from end to end as they sort of just rip in and rip this encampment down. But this has been happening, I would say, for about the better hour at this point, as agitants in the crowd around the university have been pushed out as well. This just continues to be a continuous police action, guys. Back
Steve, this may be difficult for you to see or estimate, but any idea number of protesters as well as number of law enforcement? Can you tell at all?
It's almost impossible to tell because of how fluctuating the numbers are, right? Like there used to be watch this, here we go. Look at this. Rushing apparently inside. I think they're just going to pull this wall down all of a sudden. Hard to tell, Savannah, how many protesters are still inside, how many are on the edges, how many police there are, because there are multiple agents that have been responding to this. You know, we've seen state police, we've seen the highway patrol back up there. Wall down, guys. It's live. The highway patrol has been here. The sheriff's department, some acting in more of a security role, some acting, of course, as a main sort of vanguard, which is to sort of cut their way inside here. We're going to back up. They're about to peel this wall down. I think they're going to push. They're either pushing or pulling, guys. But no, it's almost impossible to tell how many protesters, too, because I swear I've seen almost the detention at least every few minutes, if not every minute. Police are just literally pulling people out of the crowd that remain inside. Obviously, their main action, their main objective is to do what they're doing now, guys. Back to you.
Steve, your colleague Liz Kreutz reporting that some protesters are at least being detained. We know they brought buses onto the campus. You mentioned some of these demonstrators, they have helmets. We've seen they have goggles on. It shows that they were prepared for perhaps some sort of confrontation with police. And it also suggests something that we've seen at universities all across the country, which is that these are not all students. These are these so-called outside agitators who've come in. Has that been the narrative there at UCLA, the feeling that a lot of people from the outside, whether they're anarchist groups or others, have come in and taken over these encampments?
I just want to pause for a minute just to look at the unbelievable nature of this scene. They're firing flashbangs literally right above us now into the crowd. This sort of action of pulling this encampment apart happened all in one swift motion. Sort of amazing to be here to witness this on this end. The other end, it was sort of a slow, meticulous chewing through the encampment. This was very, very swift. As far as your question about outside agitators, we had a security guard that did a test, which is she knew where the commissary was. One of the students, she kept asking people, where do I go? Half of the students or half of the people in this crowd couldn't answer the question because they didn't actually go to the university. I think it is fair to say that at least, you know, we don't have numbers. We've never had numbers on how many people inside were students and how many weren't. But I think it is fair to say a fair bit come from the outside and a fair bit have told us so. Guys, maybe
Steve,
hard to hear us right now.
Actually, we can hear you quite clearly, but of course your safety is paramount, so let us know if you need to move or get to a different location at all. Steve, from what you are hearing from law enforcement as well as what you're seeing, do you believe, is the goal here from law enforcement, is the stated goal or the perceived goal to kind of get rid of this encampment at some universities? Like, for example, in Wisconsin yesterday, the school police was saying, we are acting on the fact that it is unlawful to have these encampments here. This camping gear has to go away, versus really bringing tensions down between two groups of protesters and then counter-protesters. Right now, is this to bring tension down, or is this to get rid of this encampment altogether?
Well, obviously, they are getting rid of the encampment, but I think sort of it is the chicken and the egg situation. It is one solves the other. It is the fact that this has been such a core source of contention, and it does attract sort of the other element of counter-protesters. You know, the UC system, UC California, you know, they operate multiple schools across the country, multiple schools across the state, I should say. Many of them have had minor encampments, things like this tent now coming. Look at this tent now being pushed over the edge. It's amazing to see this because we've been watching this build up for so long. So now we're watching it sort of get ripped down in real time and exposed. It's quite amazing. The stance from the university and the university system has been to let this happen. You know, this is free speech. These are students who want to exercise their right to speak out on an issue that they find important. The university has let that happen. I think it was what was when the element of safety to the other students on campus. And that night with the counter-protesters was so dangerous, talking to students that had nothing to do with these actions whatsoever. Just the fear palpable to walk by and see that, to know that this is happening right next to your residence hall or your dorm or your study hall. I think it was just too disruptive to students. Classes, of course, had to be canceled. That people had to reroute around this. This is what, like, one of the main quads on campus. You know, the library, Royce Hall. It's just too disrupted, and I think they were worried about public safety. And frankly, you know, I think a lot of people sort of understood that because of how big the footprint of this was too. You have to understand, this kept growing. This never stopped growing until right now, guys.
So, Steve, we know a number of the demonstrators have dispersed. Some have been detained. Do you get a sense right now, are there many remaining at the encampment, any making a last stand, or does it seem like police kind of have control of the situation as they try and dismantle this camp?
You know, from my perspective, and I don't have a complete perspective, obviously, Joe, the police have really, you know, infiltrated, made their way in. If there are any, and I can hear them, of course there are people screaming. I can see some of the elements of protesters pushing back against police. We can kind of go up to the line a little more with the down. Into the crowd, you may be able to see some of the elements of protesters still inside. You can hear them. Some of them still have loudspeakers. Some of them still wearing masks to cover their face. But I, honestly, from my vantage point now, most of what I see are helmets. Most of what I see is Kevlar and helmets and hearing flashbangs. Police appear to have a full command of this scene, but I can't see how deep this camp goes. And I don't know what the element is on sort of the outskirts and what the response may be. But it was very swift, very forceful, very sudden and shocking. I mean, just the, you know, you've seen me sort of react to these flashbangs as I'm talking to you. There goes another one. It's hard to keep a mental focus when you hear this. So I think just the sort of the shock and the awe, which is always sort of the situation in which they want to do as much as they can in such a small window to minimize any casualties, to minimize anybody that could get hurt. And I think they've done that pretty effectively, guys. Back to you.
Steve, you touched on canceled classes, but just give us an idea of what this has meant for the day-to-day operations for UCLA and for students who are not part of these protests.
You know, I think it's changed sort of student life entirely. And I say that because obviously of classes being canceled, classes now going online, you know, employees working from home, this has become, you know, the source of really international attention. I mean, there are British reporters here. I've seen reporters from all over the world who are right here on campus focusing on this just one thing. That being said, you know, yesterday I took a walk just sort of outside of this protest area. There are parts of campus that you would never even know this was happening were it not for the helicopters that are constantly buzzing around. But I do think that weighs heavily on you. Imagine being a student here and knowing that this is happening at all times. I think it's a huge disruption to students who are here. And we've heard that obviously from students as well, but also who are worried about their communities. Some others, of course, proud of the actions being taken, proud that this is one of the first universities to have an encampment like this, to raise this issue as much as the student and as passionately as the students have here. But is it a distraction? I mean, I think, of course, guys. Back to you.
All right, Steve Patterson, we appreciate your reporting. We're going to ask you to stand by while you continue to stay safe, and we'll check back in with you as there are developments there at UCLA this morning.
Yeah, and we'll certainly keep some of this video up throughout the morning. Let's now bring in Annika Bereni for more on the protests that broke out on the University of Wisconsin campus yesterday. We brought you those images live, and Annika is a senior reporter for the Daily Cardinal, a student newspaper at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Annika, good morning. Hopefully you can hear us. So walk us through what happened on campus during the clash between protesters and police. We know you have this sort of unique experience of being both a journalist but a student. Tell us what you saw, how tensions rose so quickly.
Yeah, hi, thank you for having me. So
I arrived at Library Mall, which is where the encampment is, around 5:45 a.m. And at that point, there was, I think, one news camera, but it was very quiet. It was very peaceful. Most people were still asleep. And then at one point, I think I was working on the Daily Cardinal, which is the paper that I write for. We are providing live blog updates, and we have been for the last 3 days, around the clock coverage, like 18 hours we've been working. But at one point I'm writing a blog update and I hear a whistle, and it's one of the protesters because they've been keeping watch. And they say, "Wake up, everybody, the cops are here." And so immediately I shoot up. I text everyone else in the newspaper. I say, "We need people on the ground to cover this." And the cops, they just kept coming. And so there were 3 different types of law enforcement that we counted. There was the Wisconsin State Patrol, there was the Sheriff's Department, and there was the UW Police Department. And so I think the videos you're showing right now really show the absolute chaos that it was. There was just law enforcement everywhere. They were pushing back on protesters. Protesters were doing their best to keep their tents up, and there was shoving to the ground. I know I saw a couple of protesters bleeding from the head. And it was just chaos all around. And especially, you mentioned as a student journalist, it's kind of this unique place where you are deeply part of the community that you're covering. And so the people I was seeing detained, the people I was seeing being shoved by cops, they were people that I've had classes with. They were my friends. They were my professors. I saw a couple of my professors there, and I saw them just being shoved by cops while they had their arms linked with others. And so that was just pretty jarring, I think, as a student, but also as a journalist, where you're standing there, you're recording what's happening, but at the same time, these are people that you know, and these are people that you have relationships with. And so it's really tough.
Annika, UW-Madison has a rich history of protest, of peaceful protest, and you kind of got that sense yesterday hearing from university officials who said, listen, we want these students to be able to protest. We just don't want the encampment. We don't want the tents. Shortly after police cleared out that encampment, it looks like students set it right back up again. So are there concerns there could be more clashes with police moving forward? What do things look like from this moment on?
Yeah, and I can speak to that actually because I study history at UW-Madison, and one of the things that I'm interested in is specifically our school's protest history. And so sit-ins have been a common form of protest throughout the university's history. In 1967 with the Dow chemical protests, there was a sit-in in what was then Commerce Hall, what is now Ingram Hall, and that was also met by just brutal beatings by the police. And these are the kinds of things that the university looks back on and says, this is part of our history. But at the same time, it's absolutely saying beating these protesters back in 1967 was not right at all. And then the other thing that I wanted to speak to is specifically the rule, UW Statute 18. And the Daily Cardinal, we did a story about this last week where we really looked through the statute, and it actually says you can't picnic, camp, makeshift shelters unless authorized by the chief administrative officer, which in this case is the chancellor of the universities in the University of Wisconsin system. And so Chancellor Mnuchin, we identified in our story, could be authorizing these encampments, but she hasn't. And so that's what led to the clashes with the police yesterday. Whether we expect to see more clashes, I think as the Daily Cardinal, we've been monitoring today since 5:30 in the morning. It's currently almost 6:30 here in Madison, but we are expecting to see more police presence. There's been a pretty constant police presence around campus, or around Library Mall specifically, but I think 2 tents were left yesterday. There was 37 in the morning when I counted. 2 were left after the police had gone, and within hours, 14 more were back up. And so I think as protesters keep putting up tents, they're standing their ground. They're saying, police presence, police shoving, as the videos are showing, and detainments even are not going to stop their solidarity with the people of Gaza.
Annika Bereni, thank you very much for sharing your experience as a student as well as your reporting. We appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
Let's bring in NBC News law enforcement analyst Jim Kavanaugh for more on what we are seeing at UCLA and really all across the country. Jim's also a retired ATF special agent in charge. Jim, your thoughts on what we're seeing here on UCLA. Is this what you were expecting we would see in the near future?
Yes, I mean, I think that the university there let things really go too far with all the encampment, the pallets, the plywood. I mean, they brought in fortifications. And, you know, at some point, it's going to have to be people leave or be arrested. And that's what's happened. You saw the California Highway Patrol moving in earlier, and now LAPD has got a section there where we're looking at now. That's the LAPD. So they have plenty of officers, and they're all outfitted in appropriate gear for civil disturbance. And they have a lot of officers. They can handle it. You know, it's a contrast to what we just saw in Madison. You know, we have policemen in Madison there with no helmets, baseball hats, and not enough officers. And that's why it gets into a melee. That's not the way to handle it. I mean, I think we're seeing a more professional response here in LA, just like we did from the NYPD at Columbia University. You have to have a large contingent of officers, a large contingent to be able to deal with it. And also, there have to be consequences for the actions of people who engage in violence or, you know, won't follow the law of the university and the state. If there's no consequences, then everything grows. If you're not expelled for the behavior or arrested, then everything grows. So there's got to be a line where you can protest, and then, you know, when you start building barricades and shooting policemen with fire extinguishers and throwing spears or whatever out of wood and all these things they're doing, you know, then you have to be expelled for those things or fired if you're a professor or arrested if you're not a student. So when there's no consequences, you know, then it grows. And so now, certainly in UCLA, they have to move in and make mass arrests. Just in closing, we're a nation of 340 million people. And I think we should keep that in mind when we look at even the crowd at UCLA. If you see a shot from a drone or a helicopter, you know, there's not hundreds of thousands of people there in the encampment. And how many there are hardcore, you know, the ones with the helmets and the masks and, you know, wielding the sticks and the fire extinguishers. Look at that number of hardcore battle bots, I would say, who want to battle with the police. When the police say you're free to leave now or you'll be arrested, a number of protesters who are not outfitted as battle bots, they'll walk away. They're real protesters. They're not there to battle the police. And yet we have a smaller faction. You know, we try to estimate the number just at UCLA. You know, is it 100, 200? It's not in the thousands. And so when those people get arrested or expelled or fired, the consequences then dampen everything down. So just to close, the reason there's not a giant crowd outside of the Trump trial in Manhattan doing the same thing is because there was consequences for January the 6th. And 1,000 of those followers of Trump were in jail for violence at the Capitol. That's why they're not outside the trial. And the same would be true here. No consequences, it'll grow. Consequences, it will fade away.
Jim, walk us through the tactics that we've seen so far from police on UCLA's campus that we were seeing and hearing as our colleague Steve Patterson was reporting, the flashbangs, the blinking lights we can see right now, the gas, and tell us the types of tools that police are using and what the end goal is when deploying those tactics.
Right, Savannah. I haven't seen them deploy any gas, maybe some pepper ball, but the officers are not outfitted with gas masks, so they're not deploying gas heavily here. When they do deploy gas, they all have to don gas masks too, and that's an encumbrance on the officers as well. So they try to avoid that if possible. They do have sting ball rounds. They do have, you see them with shotguns that are painted orange. Those are beanbag rounds. It's less lethal stun ball or pepper ball or beanbag, and it hurts when it hits, but it's not going to kill you. If it's shot from the proper distance and at your body, you don't shoot someone in the face with it, but they're trained on how to deploy those. They're using flashbangs probably to, push crowd back if they're surging forward or something, and those aren't going to hurt you either. I've had many of those go off near me, and they're not going to hurt you unless you're just, laying on top of it. But what they're doing here is the slowness of the police response to move in like this and then start grabbing and arresting people is what's going to dampen it down. You see, they've removed the barricades. Last night I was on, Savannah, and there was a lot of talk about barricades from students and witnesses and so forth about all these barricades. And you see these barricades. Last night I said, this is not going to stop the police. The barricade is really not in there. I mean, it's nothing. It's a Maginot Line. They'll go around it or rip it off, rip it down. So that's a false sense of security from the protesters. Just like NYPD went into the second floor in Columbia University with the SWAT bear truck and the hydraulic ramp. I mean, they just went around the barricades on the first floor. So they can do all that. The issue today for the police, and here's the California Highway Patrol Special Operations Unit. That's what you see there. That's their tactical unit. And, it's a university, California University, so California Highway Patrolmen are front and center here, too. And they're going to be wanting to make arrests here. And they're going to start grabbing these people. It's probably going to be a little pulling and tugging matches, but they're going to grab these people and pull them out of here and arrest them.
Jim, I want to ask you about a term we've heard a lot this week from mayors and police chiefs around the country. That's these outside agitators. I know years of covering protests, especially on the West Coast, it's something you witness firsthand, whether it's parades or protests where suddenly groups dressed in black with masks emerge, tensions rise, the goal is confrontation with police, things can get out of hand pretty quickly. Talk about who these outside agitators are, what their goals are, how much more we're seeing this in places really all around the country.
Right, Joe. Well, they're real anarchists in America. They've always been there. We've seen them almost in every civil disturbance. And what they do is they latch on to the event of the day. So if it's, Occupy Wall Street, these guys will come in and want to foment violence, where most of the people are not trying to do that. But yet they will try to, attack the police. And we saw a lot of that in Portland and Seattle. After the George Floyd murder, we saw the protests across the country largely peaceful, but we do see these anarchists who come in and try to exploit that when you have basically a civil rights movement, welling up in response to the murder of Mr. Floyd, and then these anarchists try to start the violence. So it's not even Gaza for them. I mean, it's just they want to violence. They want to overthrow the government, the order. They want to fight police. They want chaos. They live for the chaos. Now, their numbers are not really that large, so we got to also keep it in focus. I'm sure some of them are present there, as they were in the New York City event. And we'll see. The police will be able to identify them. They're known, most of them, to the intelligence units. And once the arrests are made, they'll be able to see, who's real and who's Memorex. But it's all going to depend on the behavior of the protesters with the police. Are they going to submit to arrest? I mean, like the civil rights protesters of the 60s era, and who, would submit to the arrest. They do a sit-in, at the lunch counter, and they were arrested. Okay, well, that's a peaceful arrest. They're making civil disobedience. They know they're going to be arrested, but they're not trying to, attack the officers. So there's a line. There's a line where violence and property destruction and, happen. And to one side of that is the legitimate protests, and to the right of that is criminal activity. So that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing the First Amendment in action right here, and we're seeing it when it crosses into criminal activity. It's not an unlimited right. No right is unlimited in the Constitution.
Jim, what's your assessment of how this is going on UCLA's campus right now? A little less than a half hour ago, it seemed more intense, of course. That's when we were hearing those flashbangs and seeing the police actually physically move in. Right now, what's your assessment of how this is going?
Very professional from the side of law enforcement. That we have the three major law enforcement entities in California: the California Highway Patrol, their Special Operations Unit, which you see right here, the LAPD, and the LASD, the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department. So these are all very large departments, and they have the ability to, bring in a big contingent of officers is what you need. And the juxtaposition that against what you see or saw on the campus at Madison, a handful of officers, no helmets, no baseball hats, getting into a fight where there's thousands of people. That's not a tactic that's going to help you. And then the other visual was, maybe 25 officers standing in a circle with shields around them. It's not going to do anything either. It's going to encourage people to say, we're stronger than the police. We can do what we want. We can keep them bottled up. We can surround them. We can push them back. So the police, I always say to officers when we train and talk is, police should not ever get angry, never be emotional. We as police are the state. We are the law. So we have to operate with no emotion, with no, anger. We just have to operate on an even keel, and we don't take threats. Threats we deal with. We work methodically and slowly to enforce the law without fear or favor, and only use enough force necessary to effect the arrest. And that's what I think we're seeing right here. This is really professional law enforcement at its best in California right now. And if they keep up this cadence, just like they're doing, look at this highway patrol officer here, who's, just as handcuffed a person, is putting an ID on the back so they know who they are, who the officer was, or taping them up. So, this is the way it's supposed to be. We do have students I've seen in the last few days, well, we're mad because the police are here. Well, it's hard. How do we fix that? If there's violence, if you're being attacked, and then the next thing out is, well, we're being attacked and the police didn't come, but we're mad the police are here. So these are kind of, things that don't balance out. We're going to have law enforcement in a democratic society. There's a trooper leading two protesters away, and that's the way it's supposed to happen. So very good so far. I think it will continue this way in California.
Jim, it is May. School will be winding down in the next few weeks at universities around the country. What do you think universities and police can do moving forward to try and strike the right balance of free speech, but also avoiding scenes like this from playing out day after day?
Yeah, I think you do have to really not let encampments get big. I mean, in UCLA, they're carrying in pallets. I mean, look at the number of pallets and pieces of plywood and things that have been carried in there. That stuff is all hand carried in there. They're not driving vehicles up to that quad. They're walking in with giant pallets and wood. You can't allow that. You've got to stop that. You really shouldn't allow the tents either. Protest, but you can't camp. And if you stop that, in its nascent stages with enough officers and just keep that stuff out. Also, people are walking in supplies and food. They're carrying in, cases of water, big baskets of food. You shouldn't be allowing all that stuff to go in there. You can go in there and protest, but you can't come in here with, all this stuff to live here. And you got to stop that earlier, because then it becomes harder for people to stay. I mean, they can't stay. They've got to eat. But if they're in there barbecuing and eating, then, you know, they're not going to want to leave. So you've got to kind of damp that down early. And also you have to have consequences. No consequences, it's going to build. And, you know, the students can make a decision. Okay, if you stay, if you bring that in and we identify you, you're expelled. Professor, if you do this, you can protest, you can yell and scream, but if you intimidate other students or do these other things, then we're going to fire you. And or you'll be arrested if you're not a student. So when the consequences are known and they're clear, then people will act accordingly. Some will still get fired and expelled and arrested, but it'll be a much smaller number, and you'll be able to deal with it.
Jim Kavanaugh, your expertise always welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Yeah, I feel we may be speaking with you again this morning. Thanks for your time. We're now going to listen in to KNBC. That's, of course, our Los Angeles affiliate, as we continue to monitor these clashes on campus. Let's listen in.
From UCLA, right now, the chancellor of UCLA, the chief of police of the university, and we have Karen Beck is now watching this all take, and we are told that no media will be granted access, and there won't be interviews, and there won't be a breakdown of what you are watching right now until this is over. And this in over means that officers are all safe, and everyone who has not agreed to leave voluntarily has been taken into custody. So the leaders of this university, the leaders of this university's police department, and the leader of this city are watching this now take place. And again, according to sources inside of the LA, this is going along as they had planned. It is, quote, stable right now.
Robert, we're having some audio issues with your microphone there, so we'll check back in with you shortly. But thank you very much for that update and that new information.
Yeah, so now we're going to check in with Anastasia Olmos. Anastasia, any new developments from your standpoint? What's happening there now?
So we've walked pretty much the perimeter of the encampment, but on more of the outskirts where officers aren't necessarily. So we're on the other side of the stairs right now, kind of the back side of the encampment. And we did find that CHP is blocking the entrance over here to get on the side of this would be the library and the Royce Hall. And so protesters are now gathering in front of them. This would be about 50 of them, and they are chanting, "Where were you yesterday?" insinuating that officers weren't here when the fights had broken out, and these pro-Palestinian protesters, you know, claimed that they were attacked by the pro-Israeli protesters, and so they're chanting right now. But this is really a more peaceful side over here than what we have seen on the other sides of the encampment, where we've seen people arrested. They're pushing back, they're cursing at officers, and putting lasers in their eyes, and then we've seen some people hop the fence out of the encampment. So what we're going to try to do right now is, it seems like there is a vantage point to see what's going on, because there's a lot of people watching. So what we did is we tried to come on this side over here. What we're going to take you with my photographer, Joel, and we're going to walk up and kind of see if we can get a different view. There are a lot of protesters standing on the side of the stairs, and just kind of waiting around to see what's going to happen on this side. As you can see, they've created this barrier with plywood around the encampment on all sides. And as we saw on the other side, that's where law enforcement kind of started to tear it down. But on this side, we haven't seen any law enforcement do any sort of tearing down. It seems that they're moving from one direction. My photographer right now, he is very dedicated to getting a look from this angle. So if you just stay with us, we do have our own security guard with us as well. So we are trying to stay safe out here. We have seen, as I mentioned earlier, at least 2 people leave the encampment injured. One was limping, the other, her hand was injured. And so now he's going to give you a viewpoint of what he can see as of right now. This is the backside of the encampment, where law enforcement is moving through. And And so we'll probably send it back to you guys in studio because it's not working as well as we thought it would. But we'll send it back to you.
I know it's a little chaotic out there. It's dark. It's tough to see. But quick question for you. Just wondering, is this a completely separate group of protesters, or is this a part of the group that sort of broke apart as we saw the officers moving in on the encampment?
You know, when those flashbangs started and the crowd started running, it's hard to tell where these protesters went. So some of them stayed in front of the lines of CHP that were pushing forward in riot gear. Some of them took off. And so we did see some people come from the side of the encampment and walk around and join protesters. And so I believe that this side from yesterday, they had their own crowd on the side of the stairs. I remember those aerial images of the detectives, deputies, patrol cars. That was on this side. It was much more peaceful, but there were thousands of protesters over here. And so I think that really they have been surrounding the encampment this whole time, especially when they stopped letting people into the encampment in the last couple hours. Their only option was to be out here to support those that are inside. And this is the more peaceful side as of right now. We haven't seen any clashes with law enforcement. We haven't seen any arrests or anything like that. We're just seeing, as of right now, some chanting towards CHP officers, but absolutely no violence on this side. We'll send it back to you guys.
Thank you, Anastasia. So from that vantage point, you can see people are being peaceful. Now we want to check in with NBC 4's Lauren Coronado, and she is seeing law enforcement make more arrests or detain more people. Lauren, good morning.
For the last few minutes, you've been listening to coverage from our NBC affiliate in LA, KNBC, who've been covering the protests taking place at UCLA as police have gone in to break down those encampments.
That's right. And now we're going to get back to our own Steve Patterson, who is also on the campus of UCLA. Steve, this is actually quite a juxtaposition from what we were just seeing on KNBC on the other side, it seems, of this protest, where it did seem quite peaceful. It seemed quite quiet. When we spoke with you about 40 minutes ago, that was when we were seeing police actually physically rush in, pull out those pieces of plywood, hearing those flashbangs. What are you seeing on the ground now?
Yeah, this is certainly, gotten to a point where I wouldn't call it peaceful on this side. We can walk in a little bit here. We're now inside the encampment, right? The walls have been broken down. The plywood is gone. It's a pile on the ground. Police have made entry. The last I spoke to you, it looked like police were we're going to back up. Yep, we'll back up. We'll back up. It appeared that police were sort of chewing through the camp at this extraordinary rate. And while that's true, certainly making their way in, forming a perimeter around here, that is not holistically true, because the core of it, as I've been able to go inside, it goes so much deeper than I imagined. There are tents way beyond the line of police that I'm looking at. And what's on the other side of this police line, as I try not to get hit by debris, are a line of protesters, right? I don't know how far we can push in. You might be able to see the white from hard hats back there. Those are protesters that have geared up, that have made makeshift shields, that have put on hard hats, and that are prepared to push back against police so they can't push any further into the encampment. How successful they'll be with how quickly police were able to make entry, not known at this point. Police have right now sort of formed a standstill, a line, as around sort of the edges. You can't see it like I can, but around the edges, police are just sort of piece by piece, again, continuing to tear this encampment down, sort of almost working their way around the edge and then moving toward the middle. They're now putting up you see the string that they're putting up here. I think police now sort of making their own border so the press and other people don't go inside. Or no, they're just cutting it down. So again, as police continue to push in, I think we're starting to see resistance from the protesters, the more hardcore element of the protesters, who have said no matter what, we're not leaving. Is it a rock, unmovable object and a force that keeps going? We don't know. We don't know what this is going to look like when police really decide that this is over. But I think we're closer to that situation than we are further away from it. Guys, back to you.
Yeah, so Steve, I mean, I guess that's kind of what we're bracing for at this point. Something's got to give, right?
Exactly that. I think since the call went out, it's not like police are going to go halfway in, right? The problem is that speaking to some of the protesters like I have, who have casually told me, no matter what, this is our home, we're not leaving. Where does that put us when this night has already started to go underway? And as quickly, again, I mean, I must say, you and I watched it, you and I guys sort of watched it live, how quickly they were able to tear through the first part of this and how quickly they're just pulling pieces out of this. I mean, and it's so unbelievable because, again, we've been sort of watching this encampment grow up. I watched it from a smaller footprint to a bigger footprint to sort of this fortress before police came in. And now it is sort of being taken down piece by piece very easily. It's just a matter of how hard I think police want to go against a force that is not going to budge. What does that look like? I think the people who were taken out initially were shocked by the flashbangs and the smoke. Others were probably students who were more here for the message and were more than happy to clear out. What happens with this hardcore element that has formed a line and looks like starting to push back against police here? You can see them sort of lining up. You can see the posturing from police. You can see the posturing from the protesters who are now, we've heard taunting, we've heard booing, we've heard jeering. Back from protesters who want them to leave. But we just don't know. We're here for it, guys. Back to you.
Steve, we had heard from our colleagues at KNBC just a moment ago that on the other side of this, where it was a little bit quieter, protesters were chanting, "Where were you yesterday?" She explained that as her understanding is that it was Palestinian protesters who claimed that they were attacked by these Jewish protesters and there was no law enforcement present. There's also generally been the criticism from students who are not involved in the protests at all that there wasn't law enforcement. Walk us through the timeline here leading up to police enforcement now, of course, actually being on the ground and entering the encampment.
Right. Well, I mean, you have to go back to that night where counter-protesters did come in, as you see police removing more from this encampment. The delineation there and the point of frustration from students is that fight between, and I shouldn't call it a fight because the university has sort of labeled it as more of an attack. This was protesters here in this encampment protesting peacefully, as they have been, frankly, and an element of counter-protesters coming in. That was 11 o'clock, 10:50 to be exact, that night when those counter-protesters came in. We've seen the video where they're literally firing fireworks into this encampment. You've seen how much plywood this place had, how dangerous that could be, how flammable of a situation that might be. And then pulling apart parts of the encampment, using those parts as weapons to sort of attack people inside here. Of course, the people fighting back. But the frustration was, where was the call out to get outside police forces on scene faster? Because by the time those other police forces were on scene, it had been hours. We're talking about 11 o'clock to the first police officers on scene, maybe around 1 o'clock, to the first areas of separation being made, maybe around 2 o'clock, to counter-protesters and protesters finally being totally separated by about 3:30 in the morning. So I think the frustration is understandable from people here who wanted to know why that happened. That, moved into the next day, which is those frustrations bubbling over. The university sort of posturing to say, this is less of a safe situation than we initially thought. We need to do something about this. That led to police posturing in a way in which, throughout the day yesterday, it went from police as a security force for the protesters, police as a watchdog for counter-protesters, police starting to gear up in riot gear, appearing to, after deeming this area unlawful, posturing to say that we're going to come in here eventually, and then leading to what's happening now, which is they're fully inside and taking this place down piece by piece.
And it sounds like we're hearing the flashbangs intensifying a little more here over the last few seconds there. Steve, you described this encampment as almost like a fortress. It's kind of hard for us to see because it's dark out. We're not there where you are. Can you give us any sort of sense of how big this encampment was, how much of an effort it is to try and take it down right now?
I truly can't, because I've never been able to see the inside of it from the middle, right? I don't, I was just telling you how surprised I was that police were still going and taking it down because I didn't realize how large it was. I thought I was watching the whole thing getting pulled apart. And really, I wasn't because of how big it is. It is a huge area, right? It's a big space. I don't know what the square footage is necessarily, and I don't know, even looking at it now, how deep it goes. What I can tell you is it's a fortress in by the way of how diligent the protesters have been of keeping people out. Like the minute police have torn all of this down, you look back here and there's already new plywood. Like they've created a new line against police. We can maybe kind of safely step inside here and show you because they don't want anybody else entering. And I just don't know how deep that goes, but it is a lot as now police continue to sort of poke a hole in and pull and remove tents from the inside out. But now, maybe you can see in that back left corner, more tents. Obviously, we've seen the aerial footage, but I can't give a sense of scale and scope, and more specifically, the numbers of protesters, because that has surged in and out, depending on the time of day, depending on, how far along this process has gone. What I can say is the footprint has never, ever stopped growing until police have moved inside and started to squash it. Guys?
Steve Patterson, thank you so much for your reporting. Stay safe, stand by. We will come back to you throughout the morning. Let's now go back to NBC News law enforcement analyst Jim Kavanaugh. Jim, when we were just speaking with you probably about a half hour ago now, there had sort of been a lull, at least in the flashbangs. It seemed to sort of be calming down, and now we're hearing those again, as Steve described, as law enforcement sort of starts to make the circle around what he was calling those who are hardcore, who say that they are not leaving no matter what. He also noted at one point that it seemed that those who were members of the encampment, these protesters, were beginning to push back against law enforcement at one point in time. Is this to be expected, these waves of sort of it seeming calm and then picking back up again? And as this does turn into this tighter circle, what do you expect to see?
Yeah, I got it. Yeah, well, I think what they're going to try to do is isolate. They're shaping their battlefield here. The police are shaping the battlefield. They're getting the nonviolent protesters, the ones that are not dressed up in the battle gear, that, they've arrested them on the other side, asked them to leave. Some walked away and got arrested. Some they went in and arrested. And they're dragging the tents out, and they're isolating the hardcore. We can try to watch the feed and see if we can, maybe identify the numbers of the hardcore. But, it's going to be dwindling from the total group. And once that hardcore is isolated in there, then what law enforcement's going to want to do is flank their line. So they're spread out in front. You see it's a line of officers, and the white helmets are protesters. They're going to want to, there's an end to their line. There's you go down it, and there's a person standing on the end. And so they want to have maybe a snatch team, they call it, a grab team, to go to the end and peel that person off. And now that could erupt in the rest of them leaving the line and trying to fight, or maybe just pushing and shoving. But they try to peel them off the end and make an arrest and take them away. And if they can keep that strength in their line and flank them and start pulling them off the end, that will be their desire. But I would expect some violence here, because these people they haven't come here, Savannah, dressed with, gas mask, helmets, body armor, and all these defiant statements, and picking up weapons and shooting fire extinguishers and firecrackers and bottle rockets. They want to fight. Some of these people want to fight. And so the police don't want to fight, but they're prepared to fight. So, they'd rather just peel them off and arrest them. That would be the best outcome. So I think we're going to see, and, maybe we can, as daylight breaks in L.A., we can maybe estimate the hardcore number. I can't tell from, maybe is it 100, less than 100 of the hardcore members? That's what the officers want to get down to. And they'll have many, many more officers than than the protesters. So when you want to win the battle, you got to get there the first with the most. You got to have the most people, and that's what they have, and they're prepared. And they're also their cadence of the event. You notice the law enforcement cadence is methodical, slow, planned. They have a strategy, tactics. They're shaping the battlefield. You notice they're not shooting gas. They have some stun munitions, and they have some pepper ball and sting ball, but they're not shooting a lot of gas in there, because then they have to deal with all the gas too. And they don't want to have to, all don masks and deal with that if they don't have to.
Jim, you mentioned daylight. That sort of begs the question, was there a strategy for police doing this in the middle of the night, and will daylight potentially change anything if these tensions are still going on at that time?
Well, it would probably help the officers, in their strategy, because by the time it breaks here shortly, they're going to have it whittled down. And, people that are involved in crime generally, or even civil disturbance, violence, they like the cover of darkness. They can run away and hide in a dark corner or something. Daylight doesn't give them that little advantage. Now, here we see officers making an arrest. So they're making an arrest right here. They got one or two right there. They've peeled off the line. One with a yellow helmet, one with a red helmet. See, they've peeled them right off the line. They're going to make arrests. So, was that the end of the line? I can't tell from the feed, but that's what they're going to want to do. Start peeling them off on the flank where they don't, they're not as thick, and make an arrest. So you see all the zip ties that the officers have. They're prepared to arrest every last person there. And I'm sure within a few hours they will have that done.
On the left side of your screen now, you can actually get a little bit more of an understanding of the scale of this. It looks like on the far left is one of those tents that has been taken down by police, but you can see quite a bit more still there in the center of the lawn, things we're not able to see from the vantage point that we've seen throughout the morning. Jim Kavanaugh, thank you very much for being with us. Please stick with us. We'll be talking with you throughout the morning. We're now going to listen in to our Los Angeles affiliate, KNBC, and hear their reporting from the ground.
Entire university had to close today because of the dangers that this encampment apparently had threatened on this university. So this is a very, very serious situation, and it was a very, very tense night. And the bubble popped when they finally went in. We knew it was going to happen, and we knew that it was finally going to take place, and they quickly, again, methodically got this encampment down. They got through the barriers so they could look these people in the eye and see what they're dealing with. And so now that is why when you say pulling things off of them, they're pulling whatever they're using to protect themselves. They are locked arm in arm right now. And this will be a standoff, but it seems as if whatever they were using, whatever pieces of material, tents, whatever, tables to protect themselves, they are right now they've taken most of it away from them. So the only thing that they have right now is each other as they stand arm in arm. These are the final members of an encampment that formed 7 days ago, that has been told that it was unlawful, that has been told it was a violation of university policy, and that it had stopped being a place of peaceful activism. And that is why you see CHP from across the state of California in riot gear that has arrived here to take those who do not willingly disperse. The options were given throughout the night to willingly disperse. These are the people that have not left. Some have left on their own. Some, ran out. Some found their way out. Some actually did leave voluntarily, but these are the ones that remain, and the ones who are not willing to leave and not willing to disperse, and that will have to face consequences. And depending their association with the university, then that will remain to see what those consequences are.
Robert, quick question for you. As we see police moving in, the barriers being taken down, people being arrested, have they been able to stop more people from coming in and joining this encampment? Do they have other barriers set up to prevent this from getting any worse?
You know, that's an excellent question, but there is no one that is coming into that we see that is going to become part of this encampment. What you may see are demonstrators that would have tried, as we saw in the beginning, to block access from the law enforcement that's here, from CHP, but no one here because, Robin, Adrian, this encampment no longer exists. Once these people are taken into custody, this area will be cleaned up. And you're like, well, Robert, how long could this encampment have possibly gone on if the police didn't intervene? What was the plan here? It was a question we asked initially. And we went to them and said, what's the plan here? The very first day when we went into that quote-unquote media check-in. Well, we're going to be here until June 14th. Why June 14th? That's when the quarter ends. And most of these, if they're students, have to go home. So they were going to be here until June 14th. And it was going to be a matter of would the university allow them to stay until June 14th. But within the course of just a matter of days, this week-long encampment, from the time it started on Wednesday, escalated into something that got very, very ugly for a lot of people who were just trying to be members of this university and try to be productive in this community. And for some reason, there are obstacles put in their way, whether those obstacles were human blockades that didn't allow them to go to class, or whether those obstacles were something that turned more violent. It got so ugly on Monday that finally the chancellor said that was the darkest chapter in UCLA's history. This is over. What you are looking at right now is they are about to put the final period on this chapter, and this book is about to be done.
A powerful statement there, Robert, and I know a lot of people were wondering, yes, when was this going to end when we saw that violent outburst yesterday? So again, we have seen police come in and start to break up some of these encampments. It is just about 5 a.m. right now here on Today in LA. If you're just joining us, we are live on the campus of UCLA, where police started using flashbangs to disperse the protesters, break up the encampment. They've also been making arrests as they take down the tents that have been set up, the tables that have been set up, even some of those metal barriers, the plywood that has essentially been set up as walls. That's all getting taken down right now, and people are being detained. Robin?
Yes, completely different what we're seeing now compared to when we first started at 4 o'clock this morning, or earlier this morning in the 2 and 3 o'clock hour. And it's not just students. We also saw faculty being taken into custody as well.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app, or follow us on social media.